Uh, Kichi, let's just talk a little bit about what got you into medical school and why you got interested in medicine, and maybe a little bit on growing up in Penang, right?
Yeah, well, it's hard to know why we got into medicine back then, and it's true of a lot of Asian societies. If you're good at maths, you become an engineer. If you're not good at maths, or if you're relatively good at biology, the aim of every family is to have their child becoming a doctor. So I like marine biology and human biology, you see, and probably hard to earn a living as a marine biologist.
Why marine biology? How did you get
Oh,
into that?
I always like the sea.
Okay,
Uh,
so that's why you
so
go fishing.
yeah, that's why I go fishing, and it's nice and interesting, and it's coral reefs and the sea, a nice place to be at. You see.
Did someone inspire you to go into medicine, or just started it and then got interested in
No,
it?
no, I just got interested in just human biology, and
Okay,
that's where we went on from there. See.
okay. So, I mean, you know why people get in. Some people get in for the right reason. Some people get in because they don't know what else to do. But it sounds like you got in at a time when you
It,
had options, right?
there are plenty of other options, but to be honest, other than those two fields, I never really thought of anything
Anything
else.
else?
Yes, and it was really difficult to get into marine biology in Malaysia or Singapore. There was hardly anything of that sort, and and
So,
medicine.
why did you choose the medical school you went to?
Okay, so I initially wanted to study overseas. So I was accepted to McGill University for undergraduate, but then decided to pull out because I thought that it would be too expensive for my parents. You see.
Okay.
And so waited to finish my A levels, and then with that, we had a choice of either University of Malaya or University of Singapore based on the A level results, and I chose Singapore because in Malaysia it was 1970 when we started medical school, and 1969 there were very bad racial riots in Malaysia, and I sort of was very disenchanted with the political system in Malaysia.
So, you've lived in Singapore since then?
No, I I did my medical school from 70 to 75 in Singapore, and when I finished and graduated, I only spent about 6 months as an intern or houseman in Singapore. Then I decided to go to Australia to finish my internship, and then from there, I spent 6 years in Australia doing the surgical training. And when I completed that, then I went to London for another 3.5 years to get fellowship training.
So, you were away for almost 10 years,
12.
12 years.
Because after London, I went to New York for another 18 months before I came back. So it was 12 years away from Singapore. But um, we decided to come back because primarily for the parents, both my wife's parents and myself, we felt
Closer to home.
closer to home, and we thought it was easier for them to visit us in Singapore
Than London or
than
Australia.
London or New York.
Did it actually happen? They visit you more?
No, they would come for a week, and then after that decided that it's time for them to go home. The idea actually was to hope that they would stay with us
Right.
for the rest of the time, but they clearly had a life of their own lives to lead. And
So, what made you choose surgery?
surgery was contrary to popular belief that surgeons are just technicians. Surgery is a blend of judgment as well as technical skills, but the interesting thing was that you had an immediate feedback
Mm-hmm.
as to whether you have made the right diagnosis, whether your judgment has been correct, and also a feedback in the sense of a euphoria or high after doing a job successfully. You see. So for those reasons, surgery was a blend of both an intellectual exercise as well as a technical exercise.
For many surgeons, when they're doing surgery, that's when they actually feel really, really good. Is that true for you?
No, I think the interesting bit, of course, the technical thing is interesting, but the interesting bit was the unfolding of the pathology before, during, and after surgery.
Afterwards.
Yeah, and the validation of your surgical judgment.
And how did you get into cancer surgery?
Okay, cancer surgery is quite a natural in that sense. Initially, I wanted to be a vascular surgeon, and when I was speaking to the chair of surgery in Sydney at that time, when I was about to complete my surgical training and said that I was going to be a vascular surgeon, he frowned on it and said, "You're basically a plumber, you realize. Why don't you get into something which is more interesting?" And that was a very good advice from him. Mind you, he didn't give a lot of good advice, but that was
Okay.
the best advice that he gave to me. And in many ways, it is very interesting because in cancer surgery, um, aside from the technical and the judgment, one needs to understand biology, tumor biology, and patient biology. And that's where a greater degree of clinical judgment and exercise needs to be made. And so it is a thinking man's field for surgery, you see.
I assume at the time you started cancer surgery, it was still not a well-defined field, or was it already
No,
well-defined?
it wasn't a well-defined field. So, for example, traditionally, cancer surgery was based on anatomical subsites. You're a head and neck surgeon, you're a thoracic surgeon, you're a gastrointestinal surgeon or colorectal surgeon. Whereas cancer surgery straddles many of these anatomical subsites, and rightly so, because firstly, cancer doesn't respect anatomical boundaries. If you have to do surgery to remove the cancer, it often transcends one subsite or more than one subsite. So therefore, one has to be quite adept in surgery of many, many different fields. But the main impetus for good cancer surgery is really an understanding of the biology, the natural history of the disease, and when to do surgery and when not to do surgery. And also, it is very multidisciplinary in the sense that in cancer, not all tumors need to be necessarily taken out by surgery. Equally, not all tumors need to be necessarily treated by chemotherapy, you see. And so this interaction with people of other disciplines but involved in cancer surgery helps to enhance the care for the patients, but also this cross-disciplinary interaction continually educates an individual in that field.
So it keeps you very sharp.
It keeps you very sharp and also very credible. And the reason why it is going to be very credible is because you have to continually justify your management plans with people who are also interested in that field but coming from a different discipline. And so unless you're practicing evidence-based medicine, you lose your credibility very quickly if you are suggesting treatment which is not evidence-based or which is outlandish, you see. So it helps to keep you current and also in the check, and it helps to control the exuberance that we see so often in so many different
So you
physicians.
actually spent time in Singapore, Australia, England, and the US.
That's right.
So how is that different between the different places that you've been in?
Okay. In in Australia, the the first of all, in terms of the teaching, in Australia you get very good supervision for during my surgical training. You know, there's always a lot of teaching, but the clinical volumes are very small. And nearly all of the Australian residents or registrars, when they finish their surgical training, will go to UK because in UK it's the opposite, you see.
The volume.
The volumes are large, and most of the time your consultants are not necessarily there. So it is very helpful to oneself to be able to do a lot of cases. Um, and and yet it is also very helpful to the consultant because you help to clear his clinical workload while he's doing something else.
So it's a partnership in
Yeah,
that
it's a
case. So,
partnership that's very.
so where
It,
in England were you?
I was working primarily in London. I first started out in the busiest district hospital in London, known as Whipps Cross. But
Okay.
after 6 months of just cutting and cutting, I felt that, I needed the intellectual exercise. And I've always wanted to do cancer surgery since finishing in Australia. And I was fortunate enough then to get a job as a senior registrar with the professor of surgical oncology at the Royal Marsden Hospital, which is the leading cancer hospital in London. And so I spent about 2.5 years with this professor, and then another 6 months doing another fellowship in reconstructive surgery for cancer.
At
So it
the
was
same
very
Royal
in the
Marsden.
same hospital.
Okay.
So it was very valuable exercise. And then following that, then I took another fellowship in Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York.
And what made you go there?
Well, it was supposed to be the top cancer center in the world, and the field of cancer surgery I was interested in then, in head and neck surgery. Memorial Sloan Kettering had the best reputation in the world, and it has always been the aspiration of all of people training in surgical oncology to get into that particular hospital. And I'm glad I got a position there because the training there was just fantastic. We saw in 1 month what I would normally take about 3 to 4 years to see in an Australian setting, and probably a year to see in the UK setting. So it was very, very intense training. And the good thing about New York at Memorial was that the attendings there are very committed to training, you see, and they would spend a lot of time in the operating theatre teaching us the technical skills, or at least seeing us through.
And did you find a
operation.
difference between the training in, you said between Australia and England, but what about England and the US?
Okay, so in UK, you are taught a lot of surgical judgment because the health system probably is not very well resourced. We do not order a whole battery and a blanket of tests, whereas in the US, probably because of litigation, there's a lot of more defensive medicine being practiced. But beyond that, I think that both sides have got very good training opportunities. I thought that the attendings in New York spend more time supervising and teaching than the UK consultants generally, because they assume that you're good at what you're doing and they're off doing something else.
Okay. So when you came back, what did you do?
Oh, I came back and then joined the Department of Surgery in Singapore General Hospital, and I specifically asked for that because I knew that Singapore General Hospital was the busiest hospital and that the clinical volumes would be there. And so I came back and joined the Department of General Surgery, and has been there since then.
And then how did the cancer center come about?
Okay, the cancer center came about because when we were working in the Singapore General Hospital, there wasn't a cancer center yet. They had a department of radiation therapy. Medical oncology just started. It initially started from the Department of Hematology, where some of the hematologists who were treating leukemias started to give chemotherapy to, and so it was just evolving. And then the surgeons were doing surgery, cancer surgery. And then,
Were they specializing in it at that time or not?
sorry?
Were they specializing in cancer surgery or they were
No,
doing
no,
other
they were
things
just
in
doing general
general surgery?
surgery. And then at that time, there was a plan by the government with their white paper of saying creating national centers of excellence in cancer, in heart, neurosciences, in ophthalmology. That the PermSec of Health then formed a committee to plan the cancer center, and so we were invited after some persuasion to get into the planning of the cancer center, and from then on, I was chairing that particular committee planning the cancer center around 1997, and in 1999 the National Cancer Center was the building was completed, and then we moved in and started the cancer center there.
So it's less than 20 years old.
It is less than, it's about 16 years old now. So for a period of time, I was still chair of surgery in Singapore General Hospital, as well as director of the National Cancer Center. But around 2004, I gave up the chair of surgery in Singapore General Hospital.
And how did it work out, pulling out a portion from the hospital to create new
Okay,
centers?
at the time when we were planning the National Cancer Center, we never thought of it as pulling out. In a way, we were thinking about it as SGH extending its influence into a national
So
cancer
supplementing.
center. Yeah, supplementing it. But the interesting phenomenon is that people are very tribal.
Mm-hmm.
And very soon, and much to my surprise, when I was trying to consolidate the services, not only in terms of surgery, but in medical and radiation oncology, I found that I was starting to be treated as of another tribe within Singapore General Hospital, something which I couldn't understand for the longest period of time, you see. So it was difficult initially to persuade surgeons who were interested in cancer surgery to join me in the National Cancer Center because they were comfortable in Singapore General Hospital, and also they were afraid to move to a different institution, seeing what had happened to me and being treated as something of a outsider, I see. So this tribal behavior, maybe you can explain a little bit better
It's
as a
completely
psychiatrist.
normal.
It's completely normal, you see. And in many ways, I was very surprised because when there were staff that were about to go to private practice, I would invite them to join the cancer center. And I would have thought that the people in SGH would have been happy that we managed to retain the staff. But instead, they gave me a lot of strife for doing that, something which still is a mystery to me at this point of time.
It's competition. That's the
Yeah.
mindset that comes in. So let me just switch a little bit to the school, because I think when I first came here, you were one of the main draws to getting people to come here, and you were the one who was most passionate among several people here on the campus. So what was the vision, and how did it all come about?
The vision was interesting in that not necessarily just myself, but a group of fairly senior clinicians always felt that medicine could only be really at the top level if it is academic medicine. At that time, around the late 1980s, 1988, Kentridge campus had just started, and the National University of Singapore decided that they were going to have their own hospital, National University Hospital. For the longest period of time, the academic clinical departments were in Singapore General Hospital. So when they decided to pull the academic physicians and surgeons out from Singapore General Hospital back to National University Hospital, we sensed that tremendous loss, the academic input, support and resources from the university. And we have always maintained that both the University School of Medicine as well as Singapore General Hospital suffered that loss and have never been the same. You see. Both were considerably weakened by the separation.
Just at that time, were the two in the same place, or were they one entity?
Okay, so in Singapore General Hospital, we would have a government department of surgery, and we would have a university department of surgery.
So this is like the very old English.
Very old English system. We had a university department of medicine, and then you would have a government department of medicine.
And how did it work?
It didn't work very well. There was a lot of competition, and probably within one hospital, there wasn't room for two separate departments.
So there were more than one tribe.
There were more than one tribes, many different tribes, and rather dysfunctional at that, you see, and competition, intense competition. But it also meant that you couldn't really do good studies because the patient volumes were just spread out, you see. So when the academic departments moved out of Singapore General Hospital, the senior clinicians who remained felt tremendously the loss. And we have always been asking the university's School of Medicine to come back to this campus in one form or another. And they were, for their own reasons, not prepared to come back at that point of time. So when that happened, we realized then that it might be worthwhile and opportune to maybe think about a second medical school. And so we thought that Nanyang Technological University, in order for it to become a comprehensive university, it made a lot of sense for them to have a new school of medicine, you see. And so at that time, Dr. Tony Tan was the minister in charge of higher education. And it so happened that one of his relatives became a patient of mine, and we got discussing about higher education, university, and medical education. And so I had several conversations with him, trying to argue for medical school and saying that maybe Nanyang Technological University would have been the logical one. See. Interestingly, he thought it was necessary to review medical education from the context of the economic development of Singapore, but felt that NTU was such an important provider of engineers and technicians and scientists for the country that he didn't want to perturb the system. And it was, so he said he would think about it. And then it was only after a visit to the state of Israel and studying how they could be so entrepreneurial that he realized that medical school can be a very strong tool for developing industries. And after the visit to Israel, especially visiting Technion University, he felt then that maybe it would be a good time now for NTU to start a medical school. And in many ways, Technion, which is in Haifa, resembled and the relationship between NTU and SGH, and Technion, which is up in the hills and 20 miles down in the city, the general hospital that's there. Yeah. And so he could see the parallels there and felt that maybe it would have been a good time for NTU to start a medical school with SGH. And so on his return from Israel, he called for a meeting and announced that he was now open to the idea of having a second medical school.
That was about 2000?
That was around 1999, 2000. Okay. Now, in order for that to be sold to the rest of the leadership, he invited a panel of medical school deans to come to review the medical education system in Singapore and to suggest what else could Singapore do in order for biomedicine to drive the economy, you see. And when, at that time, there were already plans for both NTU and SGH to start the medical school together. But those plans fell through. But the international panel that came, chaired by Lord Oxburgh, made the recommendation that SGH was ready to start a medical school, but that NTU wasn't ready to start yet for the next 10 years, you see. And so made the recommendation to the government that we should start a school in Singapore General Hospital, and then maybe 10 years down the road, have a third medical school from NTU. And as things have worked out, this is exactly what happened. We found another partner in Duke University. At that time, it was meant to be NTU, University of Washington, and Singapore General Hospital. University of Washington in Seattle, because they already had strong links with NTU on bioengineering, and also because Seattle was facing across the ocean from Singapore. Closer. And the feeling was then that it would be a natural partner, this three-way relationship, but for various reasons, NTU wasn't ready for the medical school. So
Hopkins was there at that time or no?
No, Hopkins came around that time, but they were not really interested in starting a medical school. they were interested in doing some research, but Hopkins was also interested in providing private medical services to the
Cancer.
Asia Pacific region in cancer and in cardiology. You see, that was, I think, a wrong strategy, because then they became perceived as being competitors with the local medical community. You see, whereas when Duke came and helped start the medical school, the focus was on education and research, and that complemented strongly Singapore General Hospital, which was strong on the clinical, but less well developed on medical education and research. You see,
So it's almost 10 years
yes,
since we signed and started. But in the last few years, we've been getting closer relationship with Sing Health, building academic medicine. You've been the driver for a lot of that.
mm.
Where do you see, and I think we've come a long way, even thinking of where we started and the expectations. I think it beat everyone's expectations, including mine. Where do you think it's going to go in the next 5 years? And maybe what lessons have we learned in the last 3, 4 years of putting it together?
I I think logically the research enterprise of Duke-NUS must come together with the research enterprise of Sing Health. Right now, some of the SRPs of Duke-NUS are still fairly distinct from that of the national centers. And in many ways, I think that both will be much better when they are together.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much only geographically, but in terms of systems and in terms of people interacting more closely together, rather than even now what I sense a town and gown divide that still exists. You see. So I think the next logical move for Duke-NUS and Sing Health is that their research enterprises must come together, because in effect, Duke hasn't got a service enterprise. Sing Health has. The education enterprise are very strongly integrated together. You know, all of Duke students are being taught in the Sing Health institutions, but you can see clearly different silos of research excellence and peaks, not necessarily talking to one another in great depth between Duke-NUS and.
So we can have more tribes if we don't watch it.
Yeah, if we don't watch it, and even though there's only a road separating the two,
Right.
it can be a bridge too far.
Right.
The lessons we have learned is this, and that is that often you may think you have a lot of good ideas, but not everyone else is persuaded about it. But you need to have quite a lot of tenacity and take a medium to a long-term view on the partnership in order to achieve some of the goals, because either they don't see it straight away, or they see aspects of it which will necessarily cause them to slow down on a closer integration necessarily, or on taking up the courses that one feels is important. You see. I think it's important in my mind for the clinicians to take much greater ownership of Duke-NUS. Is best seen in terms of what happens to Duke-NUS students when they graduate. I think it's very important for the clinicians to keep an eye on the students even before they graduate, nurture them, and then prepare them to get into the residency programs within Sing Health. Because when you come to think about it, the Duke-NUS graduates have much more limited choices than the US graduates. And even within Singapore, their choices of residency essentially only Sing Health, because the students don't rotate outside of the Sing Health institutions, you see. So unless we can show to future generation of students and potential students that the graduates have a strong career path available to them, a good future in terms of specialist training, I can foresee that there will be a lot of problems getting good students to join Duke-NUS. So in many ways, having our graduates getting good residency positions addresses the existential threat of Duke-NUS, especially when the school numbers are so small. So we need, therefore, SingHealth clinicians to take ownership of the students, nurture them, support them. And then when they compete for the residency positions, they get in not because they are favorites of SingHealth clinicians, but because they've been appropriately nurtured and mentored before they graduate. See. And then if there's a very clear career path available to our graduates, then we will have good students joining us. See.
And I think that's going to be the key in the long term. I think
Yes.
to keep that, they're the future. What about Cancer Center? I know you have a vision to build a
Okay.
brand new center.
So again,
Where would you want it to be 10 years from now?
Clearly, I must say that looking at the Cancer Center, it is with some satisfaction. We have made a mark clinically in Southeast Asia and probably in Asia. And in terms of research too, I think we are well recognized in terms of Asian cancers. The challenge for the Cancer Center, besides the perpetual problem of space, our space is being tight, is keeping good clinicians in the system. Unfortunately, the healthcare system in Singapore is not completely set up that allows for successful retention of good clinicians. And you have a private sector which is in many ways very avaricious for good staff, and a private sector that is somehow able to set up a economic reward system that is very robust, and with that then continually there's a constant pool of people joining the private sector, and the Cancer Center, like all major medical institutions in Singapore, have to wrestle with how do we keep our best doctors within the academic system, within the public system, and not
And
lose
that's
them
a
to
system-wide
It's
problem.
a system-wide problem, and I wish that the government of Singapore can see that this is a bigger problem than waiting time, and that it is going to be a structural problem if we do not successfully address this public-private sector divide. I think we should adopt systems that have been well developed in the US, in UK, in Australia, where we are able to harness our human talent, allow them some degree of private practice, and yet keep them committed to the academic enterprise. It will have to be a blend of public-private system, and that private medicine shouldn't be viewed with disdain, or it should be encouraged like what you do in Duke, where it is the success of private medicine that provides the economic resources that drives the rest of the academic enterprise. You see. So to me, it is just simply foolish to allow the current private sector to be making all the money in medicine when we have such a great opportunity for the public system to be making an impact both on public and private patients, and then using the resources that are generated from looking after private patients to drive the academic enterprise of our academic medical centers.
Tell me about the new building you're going to put up.
Okay, the new building of the Cancer Center is going to be coming up by 2019, 2020. There are two reasons why we have to build a new cancer center, notwithstanding the fact that we just moved in 1999, 15 years ago. The first is that we have really run out of space. And in many ways, we did not anticipate the huge increase in the cancer
So you've been
cases.
very successful in
Uh,
managing a very
yeah,
large volume in a small space.
in a small space. Partly because, and in a way, we had to thank the old leadership in SGH who didn't want us to have more space, because it prompted us to be able to argue successfully for a bigger space now. See. The second reason we are moving is because in the whole master development of the SGH campus, the NCC is in the way of the rebuilding
The hospital
of the
structure.
hospital. So unless NCC moves, the significant part of the new hospital cannot be built. And therefore, it is fortuitous for us that we are moving. We are moving to the old pathology building. Is certainly much bigger than what it is now, but 3 times the size we are planning for. Though we will not hit the patient volumes of 3 times until about 2040. But we are building for the future. So it is going to be a very nice building. We would have, within the cancer center, as always, a huge emphasis on research. Currently, about a quarter of our people are researchers. We know that education will be a very significant part of it, because in parallel with the increase in the incidence of cancer, we need healthcare workers to look after this increased number of cancers. So education is a big part. And then we would have what I call, within the cancer center, peaks of excellence. There will be, as always, a very strong multidisciplinary care for patients with cancers of the head and neck, thoracic, and so on. We will be building, and we will probably have one of the largest radiation oncology department in the world. 17 linacs and 4 proton gantries. We will have the proton facility within the cancer center. We will have a strong emphasis on the use of molecular pathology to help guide decision making in cancer care.
So you'll be ready for the future.
You'll be ready for the future, genomics and precision medicine. Then a 4th pillar would be immune therapy and cancer vaccines. Again, when we were planning it, we had to argue strongly for something like that, but the future is now. If
Already
you were
started.
to go to the ESCO meeting now, a third of their topics were all on immunotherapy. So, in fact, in the new cancer center, we originally planned for 6 GMP rooms for cancer immunotherapy, but we are in discussions with a biotech company for them to fund a 20 GMP facility in the new cancer center. So that will be another arm of the new cancer center, a strong focus on immune therapy, which is coming strongly into vogue now.
Very quickly.
Very quickly,
Very
but
quickly.
which we have always believed would be
Right.
necessary, you see.
So what will you tell our students, the ones who are coming in?
I tell the students that it's such an exciting time to be in medicine. You know, there's so many new developments that's taking place. Virtually any aspect of medicine they can get into that is of, students have a wide range of interests in the field, and there's a place for them virtually in every field of it. I think increasingly we'll have to be more and more academic in our approach to the practice of medicine. Teaching will always be a significant part of that. And then research is so exciting. See. At least when I first came back in 1988, there was hardly any research within this campus. Really none at all that one can
So if
think
you
about.
look back, you can see
that,
change.
enormous change. Is almost as if in this campus now, we have $200 million worth of research a year going through this campus, when virtually there was less than maybe $100,000 worth of research in 1988, 20 years ago. See. So there's a huge future in research. Admittedly, we have to try to organize our clinical departments to put greater emphasis and greater value and a proper promotion reward system into clinical research.
But that culture is coming in.
It's coming in. It's slower than some would like it to be, but I think
quite fast.
Yeah, we hope that by the time our students graduate, it will be even more hospitable for them with their emphasis on research as an important part of their medical education.
So, Kichi, you were really one of the people who got the whole campus and the school going. Anything else that you would like people to remember for the long term?
I think you and I should ride into the sunset.
I am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.